Hello and welcome to the MMO development class. So this week we are going to continue where we left off with CGS, which was, if I pull up my awesome Visual Studio solution right here, we got CGS working with some borders and backgrounds, basically image generation, things that aren't even available within Unity to begin with, because now we're at a position where we can start implementing things that just weren't possible before with the built-in Unity GUI. But we are going to run into some problems with how some of the code is currently set up. And again, as this is an over-the-shoulder thing, I mean, I have built this before, but the additional features that were added into CGS after it was initially built, and so on, started to make the code base kind of die a little bit. So what I'm going to do today is fix up some of our code and get our pseudo classes working on our block level elements and our inline elements. So I basically consider everything that's implemented with, the label callback method or the text method and so on. I consider these to be inline methods or inline elements. And then things like the div or the scroll, I consider to be more block level elements. So what I want to do is I want to implement all of these methods in terms of two methods. And the reason for that is so we do not duplicate all of our code all over the place, and it makes things just a lot more straightforward. So yeah, the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I do want to slightly refactor some things that I didn't like the organization of, because I was going for one particular style, and now I changed my mind. So I think that CGS style is going to go ahead and be nuked. There's no reason to have this particular class at all. Instead, we have our get style for element method that's on our iCGS environment. And instead of returning a CGS style, I'm going to return an iComputed style directly, just to clean up some of the code. That additional method wasn't wasn't that important. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the GUI style adapter from the iCGS environment interface. And the final thing I'm going to do is I want to add an event. Oh, come on. There we go. Called cache cleared. And the reason I want to do this is I want to have caching at different levels of my application, and I need to know when a style sheet has been rebuilt so that I can clear those respective caches. And the best way to implement that would be through an event. So now that I've done that, I'm going to jump down to the implementation of CGS environment. By the way, that was Alt-End, or Alt-Home, no, Alt-End. It's really hard to tell you guys what keyboard shortcuts I use when I don't really know the keys that I'm pressing. I just know where they are on the keyboard. But anyway, I computed style, and then we're just going to return that directly. There's no reason to have that intermediate class. Now, the next thing I got to do is I got to implement my event, my clash cleared event. Now, my clash cleared event is actually going to be implemented by reaching into the engine itself, because the engine itself has a concept of a cache, and the engine itself is where we apply our style sheets and we remove our style sheets. So it makes sense that this is going to be the person or the class that's responsible for knowing when the cache is cleared. So I'm going to also create an event up in CGS engine called cache cleared. And then I'm going to write a method, a private method down here called private void clear cache. Clear cache is going to do style cache.clear. Then it's also going to do handlers equals cache cleared. If handlers, oh come on, resharper, stop this. It's not equal null. Then invoke handlers. Okay, so now instead of invoking stylecache.clear, which we do in two different cases, when we create a style sheet and when we remove a style sheet, I'm going to invoke the clear cache method, which will fire off that event. Now the last thing I need to do is in my CGS environment, I need to handle my engine's cache cleared event. So I'm going to say engine.cache cleared, and then I'm going to say var handlers equals cache. Nope, stop that. I can't type today. If handlers does not equal null, then invoke handlers. So that just lets us attach ourselves to the cache cleared event for any other things that we might want to cache, which we will be getting to very shortly. So now that we can monitor that, if I jump back into my CGS GUI builder, we're going to have two sets of errors. One set of errors due to the fact that we changed the signature of getStyle for element, and the other one is due to the fact that we removed the adapter from our CGS environment instance. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a couple static private read-only, or private static read-only, I like that more. Private static read-only iCGS environment, and a private static read-only. No, what am I doing? I'm doing something. Where do I want my adapter to go? Well, I want my adapter to go basically... Actually, now that I think about it, you know, the adapter really doesn't... Well, we can leave it a class. We can leave it an instance class, and then we'll also do it up here. Private, static, read-only, GUI style adapter, and then I'm going to say static CGS builder, or CGS GUI builder, and I'm going to get my environment instance, which is CGS environment.instance, just to clean that code up a little bit, and my adapter will be a new instantiation of my GUI style adapter once ReSharper catches up. Okay, so that should make our code a little bit more straightforward. Now we got to go down and fix some of these issues, but like I said before, I don't really want these methods implemented the way that they are currently being implemented, because there's a lot of repeated code. I really want to implement all of these methods in terms of the two methods I was talking about earlier, an inline element and a block level element. So let's go ahead and write our inline element first. Now the inline element method is going to look a little terrifying, and the reason it is because it needs to handle a wide variety of different kinds of inline elements. Now the signature is going to be very important. The signature is going to have a string type for the element type. It's going to have a GUI content for the content that's going to go into the inline element, and that's used to calculate the size or the rectangle of the element. It's going to have an IEnumerable of IElement attributes. So it has this list of attributes, and then it's going to have a terrifying delegate. And that terrifying delegate is going to be the delegate that's responsible for invoking the specific kind of inline element that we want to create, such as a button or a label or whatever. But unfortunately, we need to pass, in order to handle all the different cases of inline elements that we have in the system, we need to pass in a lot of parameters. The first one is the inline element is going to calculate the rectangle that the inline element should handle, so we're going to pass in a rect. Next up, we're going to pass in an IElement, which is going to be the, come on buddy, there you go, which is going to be the element that was created by this method. Next up, we're going to pass in a GUI style, which is the GUI style that was created by this method. And the final thing we need is the computed style, which is the CGS style for this method. And then I'm going to call this delegate parameter a renderer. Or how about a render action? That sounds better. me go ahead and collapse this so we can view this all on the same line. Now, the inline element is going to be very similar to what we've been doing with our labels and buttons and sliders and repeat buttons, because basically we're getting rid of all of that duplicated code. So we're first going to create an element, passing in its type, passing in its attributes, then passing in a delegate. Come on, there you go. And for some reason, ReSharper 8 decided to reset my settings for style or for formatting multi-line lambdas, and unfortunately I took a cursory glance at the options and couldn't seem to find what option it tweaked. So we're just going to have to live with that for, well, a little while at least, until I get completely fed up with it and go line by line through the ReSharper configuration. Inside of this element, or inside of this delegate, the first thing I'm going to do is compute my style, which is going to be style equals environment.getStyle for element. So that's my base style. The next thing is I need my GUI style. My GUI style is going to be adapter.adapt element style. So now that I have my style and my GUI style, the base style and GUI style, I need to get my rectangle. So I'm going to say rect equals GUI layout utility.getRect for content and GUI style. We've already seen an example of what this method does in our button right here, and we use that rectangle in order to determine if the mouse is over that element or not. So if you guys recall, by invoking GUI layout utility.getRect, we are reserving space in our GUI and getting the rectangle back. So now I can say if rect.contains event.current.mousePosition, then we're going to add a pseudo class of hover. Then if input.getMouseButton 0, or yeah, that's the one, we're going to add a pseudo class for active. Now, if we did either of these things, we have to recalculate our style and our GUI style. So I'm going to say style equals environment, get style for element, and then I'm going to say GUI style equals adapter.adapt element style. So now that we have our rectangle and our style, we can pass it off to the renderer, or the render action, that's what I called it. Passing in our rectangle, our element, our GUI style, and our computed style. Okay, so this gets rid of a lot of repeated code all over the code base, so let's see how this looks. Now, for my label, I'm actually going to remove this label method. The reason I'm removing this label method is because it's been pretty much superseded by the inline element method. And by removing that method, it'll give me a nice roadmap of all the code I have to fix through the errors that I just generated. So let's go ahead and implement our first inline element then. Let's do our labels first, why not? So I'm going to say inline element, I'm going to pass in the type, which is going to be h1, passing in the GUI content, which is going to be new GUI content passing in text. Then we're going to pass in our attributes. Then we're going to pass in a lambda that will look terrifying. And that's going to be rect element GUI style style. Now, all this lambda needs to do is it needs to invoke GUI.label, passing in the rect, the content, which I'm going to go ahead and, just so I don't have to instantiate this twice, go ahead and say content, passing in the content, and passing in the GUI style. Now, in this particular instance, we don't need to use our element or our style parameters, but we will in other cases. So that's what our new inline element looks like. And now we can implement our inline element for all of our things that used to use label, which it might not seem like, well, why do we do this if all we are doing is replacing the stuff that uses a label? But the cool thing about inline element is we can also use it to implement our buttons and our other things, our sliders and our stuff. Okay, so those are all of our basic inline elements. We have a couple more advanced inline elements, such as text and password. So let's go ahead and write those. What text is going to be is it's pretty much going to still do the temp text thing. I'm going to do another content, new GUI content, passing in temp text. Then I'm going to say inline element text, passing in the content, passing in the attributes, then passing in, hold, come on, there you go. Rect element GUI style, and then I'm going to say temp text equals GUI.text field, passing in my rectangle, my temp text, and my GUI style. Actually, I can go ahead and inline this GUI content. Or not. I guess ReSharper really wants to update background files right now. I don't really know what that means. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen this dialog before. And I'm afraid to hit cancel, because the universe might implode. You never know what ReSharper's really doing behind the scenes. It probably involves lots of black magic. So I'm still waiting. See, this is what happens when you upgrade to a new major version of any piece of software. I'm just so close to going back to ReSharper 7 because this is unbelievably ridiculous. How did this pass their QA department? They have to have like a bunch of test solutions that contain like thousands upon thousands of files to do testing with. And I know my computer isn't that old. Okay, this is just asinine. I'm going to go and just cancel. Hopefully it didn't break anything. Alright, let's go ahead and manually inline this variable. I don't know the last time I ever had to manually inline a variable, because you know what, ReSharper used to do that for me, but I'm not going to wait around for a year. Okay, so now we have our inline element for text, and that's all that is. Again, the reason we need the temp text is because we cannot use a ref in a lambda. Now let's go ahead and do password. Password is very, very similar, except for we do password, and then we also, instead of doing GUI.text field, we do GUI.password field, and we have to pass in the character mask. For readability, let's go ahead and do that, and then we can get rid of the rest of this. Yeah. So there's our passwords and our texts, and now we have buttons. So a button is going to be very, very, very similar, except for instead of temp text we have on is false, false, false. There we go. Passing in a button. As far as the GUI content, we're going to be passing in new GUI content of text. Then we're going to say on equals GUI.button, passing in rect. Let's go ahead and alias that out into content. Let's go ahead and pass in rect content GUI style. And then let's go ahead and return on. Alright, now let's go ahead and do a repeat button. Repeat button is the exact same, except for we have a different element type and a different render action. Okay, so next up we have to do the toggle. Now, oh, that's going to be problematic. I'm going to go ahead and add in my inline element function method. I'm going to add a... Ugh. Okay, ReSharper, don't fail me here. Or no. I usually really like having my delegates be the last parameter, but for the sake of this particular exercise, I'm just going to say string additional SPSEUDO class equals null. And the additional pseudo class will, not surprisingly, be used to add pseudo class. Okay, the reason I had to do that was because my toggle can could add the on pseudo class to the element if it's on. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement this. I'm going to copy that over, dump that in, change the name, change this to temp on equals, say GUI.toggle, passing in rect, boolean, temp on, the content and the style. And then I also have to pass in one final parameter, which will be the additional pseudo class that's added if this is on. So if it's on, I can go ahead and say, so if temp on, pass in on, otherwise pass in null to not add any pseudo class to this. All right. So there's our toggle. And now we have our slider. Now our slider will be a little bit more involved than all the other inline elements that we have, but the good news is that we can implement our slider in terms of our inline element method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say inline element of slider, passing in GUI content of none because the slider doesn't have GUI content. Passing in my attributes, and then I'm going to pass in my render action, which will be rect element GUI style and style. And then I will reformat this manually because, again, one of these days it's going to irritate me so much I'll find the option to change that. Now inside of my inline element, I need to basically do everything that's in this code. So I'm just going to copy and paste that over. I need to create my thumb element, I need to create my thumb style, and my thumb GUI style. Now my thumb GUI style needs to be set to adapter.adapt because I changed where that is instantiated, and the thumb style.style is no longer required because I removed that intermediate class. I no longer need to compute style or GUI style because those are computed by the inline element method and passed in through GUI style and the style parameters. I do need to get my flow property, which is pretty straightforward. I just need to do style.getProperty. And I do need my temp value. So I'm going to move my temp value up to above that. And then instead of doing GUI layout.horizontal and vertical slider, I'm going to do GUI.horizontal and vertical slider and pass in the rectangle that was computed by the inline element method. Next I can delete that and then leave the last line as it is. Okay, so there's our slider. The last two things that aren't implemented are the two block level elements, my scroll and my div. Before I implement those though, what I want to do is I want to move pretty much most of this code into another file, because I really only care about my inline element, my block element methods. All the other methods are really, they're just different variations of invoking inline element or block level element. I mean, if we look at, slider that just invokes inline element, well, slider is the most complicated example. If we look at toggle, it's just different configurations of essentially the same method invocation. So to clean up our code and to make writing our more advanced code easier, and to make way for the code that we're going to have to write next week when we get into positioning, I'm going to create another class. Well, it's not going to be another class, it's going to be another file specifically, called GUI Style Adapter Overrides. Or overloads, sorry. And I'm going to make this a partial class of GUI style adapter, which requires that I change both the definitions GUI style adapter to a partial class. And why did I do that on GUI style adapter? I was just seeing if you guys were paying attention, and it looks like you weren't. So, yeah. It's a CGS GUI builder overloads. Okay, so now that we made CGS GUI builder a partial class, I'm going to move all of this incredibly repetitious code into my other partial. I don't do this very often, but whatever. It does make code a whole lot cleaner in the certain instances where it's required. I mean, obviously, the reason I don't find myself doing this very often, creating partial classes like this, is because typically classes that I write are not this large and long-winded. The problem is that the CGS GUI builder is long-winded by necessity, simply because it has all of these different methods for each one of the elements that it can use, as well as each one of the attributes that it can use. Now, I could certainly break things up into different classes, and I was thinking about doing that, but my conclusion was that it wouldn't really add a whole lot, that moving it into different partials wouldn't add. I don't know. Anyway, so there's our thing. Let's go ahead and move scroll over as well, or div over as well next to scroll. Because, you know, we're fairly certain that, again, all this code does is it just depends on our inline element. And once I get done with scroll and div, it'll only need one additional method for block level elements, which we'll go ahead and implement right now. Now, the block level element method can look like this. We need a type. We need our renderer. I'm actually going to pass in my attributes first. Then I'm going to pass in my render action. My render action is going to be pass in a GUI style, an I element, and an I computed style. And I'm going to call this render action. Oh, stop that. There we go. Okay, so the block element, I'm just going to leave this very straightforward for now. What it's going to do is it's going to create an element, passing in type and attributes. I'm going to wait for Visual Studio to catch up, which I do believe this is something that's caused by ReSharper, because it only started happening when I installed ReSharper 8. There we go. And I'll go ahead and reformat this. This is starting to get really irritating. Okay, so once we create the element, I'm going to just do a really simple naive implementation for now, which is basically going to borrow almost verbatim from my div implementation. The only difference is that I now need to change this because of the earlier changes I made to the code base, and then as well as that, and as well as that. Okay, so basically, that's all we have to do for now. We'll add some more stuff in later. And then I'm going to do a render action with the GUI style. Come on, Visual Studio. Come on. There you go. Passing in the element and passing in the style. For now, that's all we're going to do. So let's go ahead and see how this would be implemented, or how this would change the implementations of my div and my scroll. Well, my div, because pretty much the entire method was copied and pasted out of div, the div itself is going to be very straightforward. It's going to say block level element div, and then it's passing in its attributes, and then its render action. All the render action is going to do is it's going to pass through the action parameter that was passed into div itself. We need our style, our element, our GUI style, our element, and our style, and then I'm going to simply invoke action. And that's the extent of our div implementation. The reason that I broke this out into a block level or a block element helper, though, is because our scroll implementation will become a little bit more complex, not a whole lot, and I didn't want to repeat all of the positioning and styling code of my div inside of my scroll. So to implement this, basically everything remains the exact same as div, except for we do need our temp position. And our render action is going to, instead of just invoking action like our div does, it's going to begin a scroll view and end a scroll view. And that's it. Oh, and then of course, I have to go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick rundown to make sure I didn't forget any other element types. Okay, so there's our scroll view and our div implemented in terms of our block element method. So now we have two methods instead of 10 million that all of the elements are implemented in terms of, which makes it so we don't have to repeat ourselves all the time. I'm going to go ahead and hit F6 to compile, bring down Unity to make sure that we didn't break anything, which we very well might have. And it looks like everything is still working all right. Okay, so we have a little bit more to do to make our block level element work with our mouse cursor, but I'm going to go ahead and head off for a few minutes, and then when we get back, we'll finish that up. And we're back. Okay, so already our code is looking a whole lot more cleaned up. We really now only need to worry about the implementation of two methods, which allows our code to be a whole lot, well, easier to work with. So now we have to implement our block level elements, and those include our scroll bars and our divs. An interesting consequence of the way that I wrote this is that because the block element is responsible for beginning the horizontal or the vertical based off the flow property, our scroll bars, or our scroll viewers, can now be changed, their orientation can now be changed depending on the CGS itself, and it's not something you have to actually code in, which is very nice. That was an actual requested feature of CGS. So it's good to see that implemented. So now we have to figure out how we are going to determine if the mouse is over a block level element. I could get into the details of how I did this initially with the first version of CGS. It involved going into the source, which is, by the way, this is the decompiled source of GUI layout that you're looking at right now. And I can't remember where it was. Great instance of type. I think it was something like, yeah, it was layouts group, GUI layout group equals that. Something like that. Anyway, the point is that I actually went through the source code of GUI layout, found the, there's an internal member on GUI layout, or the GUI layout helpers, I can't remember which one, that gave me the rectangle that was produced by beginning a horizontal or a vertical. Unfortunately, that code was really horrible, and, well, it worked, I suppose. But since the initial version of CGS, there's been a better way to do that, and that's by caching the rectangles that are created by our horizontals. There's a really neat little thingy. It's a GUI layout helper, no, GUI layout utility dot get last rect. Get last rect will return the last rectangle that was generated by GUI layout, which it doesn't help us on the first invocation of our block level element, but because Unity's GUI system is an immediate mode GUI system, and because it does multiple passes over our GUI method, we're able to cache it on the first pass and retrieve it on all subsequent passes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a really simple little utility class called rectCache, which will be responsible for, well, caching rectangles. The first thing I want to do is there will be a public static, or a private static read-only. Come on, ReSharper, you can do it. Read-only rectangle. See, this is getting frustrating because it used to be when I hit Control or Alt Shift Space that it would bring up rect like that. But now for some reason, it sometimes doesn't. See, it did it that time too. Why doesn't it do it sometimes but does it other times? I don't know. You very well be seeing me run ReSharper 7 next week. Anyway, so I want a static rectCache that sets my default rect to, come on, there you go, 00 screen.width, screen.height, and by the way, that lag is on my screen as well. And then we're going to have a private read-only dictionary of string and rect called rectCache, which will instantiate in our constructor. Seriously. Oh, why is it doing this to me? There we go. Hold on. Is it going to come up? And there we go. Okay, so there's our rectCache constructor. I want a public void clear cache method, which clearing the cache is really straightforward because all we do is clear the cache. Next up, we have our getRect for element. See, it did it again. I hit Alt-Shift Space, and it auto-selected GUI element when it would have normally auto-selected iElement, which is the one I wanted. Anyway, we'll go ahead and say return if cache. See, this isn't a beta release of ReSharper. This is literally the release of version 8. Well, you'd think they would do a better job than this. Look at this. I'm not even touching my keyboard right now. And you guys see the letters appear like 3 seconds in between? This is pathetic. Anyway, try get value, passing in element.uniqueID out result. If we get it, then we'll return result. Otherwise, we will return default rect. Okay, like, wow. Funny thing is I actually do know people who type that slow, so it's bringing back really horrible memories. There we go. So there's our getRect for element method. Now let's go ahead and write our set element rect, iElement element rect. We'll use our element's unique ID to set the rect. Okay, so there's our really awesome 39 line long class that took a whole lot longer to write than it should have. What I'm going to do now is we need to go ahead and instantiate it within our CGS GUI builder, and we need to make sure that whenever the style sheet cache clears, that we cache our rectangle cache. So to do that, I'm going to jump into our CGS GUI builder overloads method, because that's where our static constructor is. And I'm going to create a private static read-only rect cache. I'm going to instantiate it. Eventually, I'm going to instantiate it. And I mistyped new, so now I have to wait 10 years for me to new. Oh, come on. Rect cache. Then I'm going to do enviro. Well, no. enviro nment dot, what is it called? CACH cleared. There we go. Okay, there we go. We now have a rectangle cache. Now, the way that we're going to be using this rectangle cache is jumping back into our block level element. At the end of our block level element, we are going to say rect cache dot set element rect, passing in our element, and then passing in GUI layout utility dot get last rect. And then all we need now is at the beginning of this method, I need to determine if the mouse is over this element. To do that, all I gotta do is say if rect cache dot get rect for element, passing an element dot contains event current mouse position. Then we say element dot add pseudo class hover. And then we're going to say if input dot get mouse button down, or get mouse down 0, or get button whatever 0, element dot add pseudo class active. Okay, so if this works, we should be able to jump into Unity, and let's jump into the actual thing that's being built here. We have a div with an ID of page wrap and a g.button inside of it. Let's also toss in a slider, because now we have our slider thumbs being styled, so that should do whatever. Scorp, I actually, that feature already exists in ReSharper, and that's when you hit Control-Shift-Space. The reason I've been doing that now is because last week I got so irritated by how slow the IntelliSense was that I went in and disabled the whatever, one of these things I disabled the thing with. Yeah, the namespace completion thing. Anyway, I disabled it so that it didn't do it by default, but it still has problems. Anyway, let's go ahead and write in a slider. I'm going to say slider, passing in a ref of slider value, a min of 0 and a max of 10. So now we have our button and we have a slider. I'm also going to jump into my actual stylesheet.cgs. I'm going to open this up, run this, and hey, there's our button. Now our slider doesn't appear, but the cool thing about that is all I gotta do is say slider background of dark gray, and there's our slider. Then I can say thumb inside of the slider and give it a background of white. and a width of 10 pixels. And a height of 10 pixels? Or do I want to get a... Oh, sorry, the slider is actually, yeah, it's the wrong way. Which I can change by setting its flow to vertical. So I can go ahead and say flow vertical, and then change the width. Oh, what am I doing? Did I get the flow mixed up here? There we go. There's our awesome slider. Yeah, that's right. Anyways, we have a width and a height. I don't even need to set the height, or no, I do need to set the height to give it a, well, its height. But the point is I can now style the thumb and the slider. I can give the thumb a border of 1px solid red. Then I can give the thumb hover. Actually, I'll do a slider hover, and then if we're hovered over, I want to give the border color to be blue, and it's not solid because it's always solid. So now if I hover over the slider, the thumb turns blue. Okay, so now let's do our... I am sliding something. What do you want me to do? Okay, so let's go ahead and do our page wrap. Give it a padding of 20 pixels. Now, let's test our page wrap to make sure that it can even be, or it does its hover states properly. So I'm going to say page wrap hover. For hovered over the page wrap, I want to give it a background of dark gray, and as you see here, oh, there we go. Okay, so that works. And then to make sure that our hovers work on nested elements, what I can do is I can say if our page wrap is hovered over, our button will turn white. So now you see our hover states are working appropriately. And let's give our button like a margin bottom of 20 pixels. All right. So that is our basic implementation for block level elements and for inline level elements, which they don't behave the same way as inline elements in CSS because there isn't that concept doesn't exist inside of Unity. But the point is that it's now very straightforward to go ahead and style out our GUI. As far as using this value to do something, I guess I could go ahead and do something fun with that. Let's put our camera at 0, 0, -10. Let's create a cube, place it at our origin. Then let's toss in some lights on that. Game object create point light at 0, 0, 10, 0. Now I want a directional light. Again, I want to create another directional light. Place this at 0, 10, 0. Place its rotation to the origin, and then manually use the rotation tool because I forgot which axis I want to rotate in. Let's actually move it a little bit like that. Actually, what did I do the position for? Positions don't matter for directionals. Anyway, so there's a cube. Let's go ahead and give our target screen a public game object to move. Go back here and then say slider value 0 to 10. Let's do, yeah, 0 to 10 is fine. And then I'm going to say toMove dot transform dot local position equals new vector 3, or what am I? No, yes, no, yes. Then let's move it in, which axis do I want to move it in? I want to move it in the x-axis, or axis, however you pronounce that. So I'm going to pass slider value into that. Go back into Unity, hit play. Oh, I forgot to set the toMove on my thingy, so I'm just going to say toMove equals cube. And then we can make this even more exciting by setting the slider value to -10, 10. Or we can make this even more exciting by doing something like private vector 3 target position blah blah blah. Target position. Let's set our target positions Y and Z to 0, which they are by default, and then we say toMove, or let's do this on update. Actually, let's do this whole thing in onUpdate. It's usually better to do it on onUpdate anyway. So then I'll say our vector equals mathf dot smooth damp, giving it a vector 3 dot smooth damp, giving it a current vector of toMove dot transform local position, a target to target position, the velocity to vector 3 velocity, ref velocity, and then a smooth time of 1. And then actually I can just go ahead and set toMove.transform.local position to that. Well, that was anticlimactic. Oh great, now I'm going to sit here and figure this out. Oh, it's not on update. Derp. Why do they have inconsistent method names? That just irritates me, I'm sorry. Anyway, get rid of that awful hover state thing, and let's make our slider horizontal again. Because that would make more sense. Give it a height of 10 and a width of, don't give it a width. Anyway, so yeah, there's our awesome cube that gets kind of animated from the left to the right of the screen. So I guess that's super exciting. Let's get rid of that awful hover state thing too. And that button is really irritating. The button looks ugly. There we go, it looks less ugly now. Alright. So, yeah. One thing that we could try to implement are the scroll thingies, the scroll handles. Let's just go ahead and see about doing that. If we look at the implementation of our scroll method, we invoke GUI layout.begin scroll view. Now scroll view can take in a GUI style, but it can also take in a vertical scroll bar GUI style and a horizontal scroll bar GUI style. Wait a sec. You can't take in both? Scroll. Oh, I have to do this one. Let's think about this for a second, because I need to implement this overload, which means I need an always show horizontal and an always show vertical, and then a GUI style for both the horizontal scroll bar and the vertical scroll bar. So to do that, I could use the overflow CSS property, which, yeah, let's go ahead and implement it. Let's write another CSS property. I'm going to jump into property types. I need 3 more properties. I need overflow. Oh, don't tell me I already have an overflow property. I do have an overflow property. What do I even use this for? I use it for something. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement an overflow Y and an overflow X. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Do I need an... Let's go ahead and implement... Oops, I don't want an enum called enum1. Oh, wonderful. I want an enum called overflow. Overflow will have auto and scroll implemented. Hidden won't be. Overflow Y will be a... an enum property. Passing in overflow. Come on. There you go. And it's going to be basically this, that, and then we have auto. Auto is the default. Come on. Come on. Auth. I don't know where auth came from. Then we need scroll, and we don't need a third value. Actually, I can go ahead and just rename this. I can call this scroll bar property. Oh no, but then I have to do a bunch of other stuff. Let's undo that. I'm just going to do an overflow Y and an overflow X. Okay. Change this to overflow Y, overflow. The default is going to be overflow auto. Then let's do our overflow X property. There you go. Oh, come on. Wow, right when I try to get... There we go. Okay, overflow X and overflow Y. Let's jump into our engine and add those two property types to default. Okay, then let's jump into my thingy over here, and let's implement our scroll thingy. So I need two booleans, one for knowing if the left or if the horizontal scroll bar always shows, and one for knowing if the vertical scroll bar always shows. So to do that, I need show X scroll bar equals style.get property overflow X property dot value equals overflow dot scroll, and show Y scroll bar equals that. Then I need two additional elements, so I'm going to do equals new element, passing in an element type of X scroll bar with the parent of element. Oh, come on. And then we need our vert scroll bar element, which will be our Y scroll bar. Then we need our horiz scroll bar style, which is going to be adapter.adapt horiz scroll bar element with the computed style of environment.getStyle for element horiz scroll bar element. Then we need our vert scroll bar style, which will be our vert scroll bar element. Okay. Then, now that we have those two styles, I can now use the overload of this, which is going to be always show horizontal, which is going to be show X scroll bar, show X scroll bar. Oh my god. Then we need our vertical show Y scroll bar. Then we need our horizontal scroll bar style. Then we need our vertical scroll bar style. Then we need our background style, which is just our normal GUI style. Alright. So there's our basic scroll view. Now I'm going to go ahead and compile this, jump into this, and let's go ahead and build a scroll bar, or a scroll view. So I'm going to say scroll, I'm going to give it a class of things, that's a terrible class name, but whatever, ref of scroll position, and then an action of reformatting this code because I don't know why those settings got changed, And then for each, or how about for var I equals 0, I smaller than 100, plus g dot h1 Alright, so there's our scroll bar. Now let's see if we can style it. Or not. Element with the same key already exists in the thing. CGS, engine internal computed style property item. Oh. Oh, I know what I did. I was like, where's my overflow Y property? I hate my life. I don't know why ReSharper did that. I don't care. Let's go ahead and fix that. Overflow Y property. There we go. Okay, jump back into Unity, hit run. We have to build this first. Unable to define style thumb. Oh yeah, that's why I didn't do this in the first version of CGS. Yeah, let's not worry about styling the things just yet. Worry about that next week. Really? Oh, yeah, if I do any GUI styles, then... How did I... Huh. That's interesting. Not entirely sure what exactly is going wrong with that, or how I handled that in the first thing. Well, I can't remember how I exactly got rid of those. Or wait a sec, did I forget to... I forgot to build, didn't I? Why does this always happen to me? Oh, hey, look, I just forgot to build. Anyway, so there's our scroll bar. I'll worry about styling the thumb later. Or a scroll view, whatever it's called. Now if I were to give page wrap a width of like 500 pixels, hey look, we have a width of 500 pixels now. So that's cool. Then I could also do stuff. Anyway, there's one more thing I want to do today, and that is clearing up a bug that's been really, really irritating me. If I were to go into U and change this to page dash wrap, jump into here, change this to page dash wrap, which is perfectly legal CSS, we get a parse error. So let's go ahead and fix this. I'm going to jump back into my main solution, jump into my tests, and I need to add in my parser test, I believe that's, wait a second, did that error come from the parser or the tree parser? believe that came from my Lexer. Good. Which means it'll show up in my parser tests. So I'm going to say public void IDs with dashes work. The test is going to be parse CGS page dash wrap. What's inside of it doesn't matter. String tree should be rule selector ID selector of page wrap. So if we run this test, we should get an error. Why does it say there's one error? I don't even know anymore. Why did I launch it in Explorer? I don't know why I did that either. Okay, so we get one failing test. A null reference exception, that's fine because it's displaying a recognition error. Okay, so let me go ahead and fire up my my ANTLR file watchers. So to do that, go into 3D Buzz, this and that, and fire you up. Jump into my compiler and open up my CGS.g3. So the problem is coming into play, I believe, because my class selector is looking for a class selector ident, and a class selector is defined as, oh no, it's looking for a dot ident. Wait a sec, why am I looking at that? ID selector, there we go. Looking for a color hash. This is problematic because of the way ANTLR works. ANTLR processes the entire Lexer before going to the parser, which means that the Lexer doesn't have any semantics to go off of to determine if a hash is a color hash or an ID selector. So to fix this, well, to fix this, we could go ahead, a quick hack would be to go into our color hash and allow the inclusions of dashes or underscores. Which I know seems like a bit of a hack, and it is, but it's just getting around the limitations of, well, my knowledge of ANTLR. And as we see right now, IDs with dashes do now work. Alright, well, according to both CSS grammars that are listed on ANTLR's website, they do not validate hex colors at all. Which means I feel a whole lot less bad doing this. Which again makes the test pass. And by making the test pass, I should now be able to have identifiers or IDs that are identified with dashes within them. And to test that, we can go ahead and hit run, and we see that our code works even though our page wrap does have a dash in it. Yeah, this is kind of fun. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up everything that I wanted to take care of today. We got a bug in our grammar fixed, which is nice to see. Well, I guess we could do one more interesting thing. I mean, basically, the majority of what's really left with this is just throwing different things at the wall and seeing if it works, other than, of course, absolute positioning and percentage widths. That's going to come next week. But let's go ahead and do something interesting. I want to go ahead and change this to g.span with the class of item. Oh, what are you complaining about? Oh, that comes afterwards. And then I want to go ahead and say private int selected index. I don't want to do g.span, I want to do g.button. And then I want to say selected index equals I, or we can go and say what am I doing? G dot now what happens if I pass null? It's probably going to throw an exception. Let's fix that. I want to be able to accept nulls in my iElement attribute thingies. So to fix that, I need to go into my CGS GUI builder, jump into my create element, and say in attributes where a does not equal null. Okay, so now what I can do is what do I call these things? These are buttons inside of things. So now I can say I'm going to remove this entirely. I'm going to say things button padding of 5 pixels button dot selected color is red. And hey, look, now I can select items. So that's cool. I can basically do this all day. But I think that's going to go ahead and wrap everything up. Again, we got our GUI builder turned into something a whole lot nicer than it was before, in that we basically only have 2 methods we care about, inline element and block element. We fixed that bug and a whole lot of other stuff. So yeah, to all you future people, I will see you all next week.